Hello, everyone. I'm Professor Jinhua Zhao, City of Transportation at MIT. Welcome to the MIT Mobility Forum. Today, it's really my pleasure to have Annie Dasgupta from World Resource Institute joining us, really talk about his new book on the new global possible. As many of you know, last December marked the 10th year anniversary of the Paris Agreement. In 2025, world leaders came together to save the planet. At that time, everybody cheered, right? Obama was the president, the whole world was hopeful on this, right? But this year we'll have the COP31. Do we have much to show? And how much can we continue to cheer on this, right? So on this case, can we rebuild optimism amid a climate crisis and do so at a speed and scale? I'm so glad that Annie Dasgupta said yes and wrote a book to show how do we do that. That's the book, New Global Possible, Rebuild Optimism in the Age of a Climate Crisis. Annie is the president and CEO of World Resource Institute. Before that, I also want to add another important experience. He was the director of knowledge in World Bank beforehand, where he developed the bank's first knowledge strategy to try to really transform the bank from distributing the money to distributing knowledge. So I just cannot that part important background. I'll come back to this background when we discuss during the dialogue there. Right. So Annie, so great to have you here. Do you mind introduce yourself briefly?
Not at all. Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for joining. Jinhua, thank you for doing this. And I really appreciate this opportunity to talk about. I think for me on my side, if you don't know WRI is an organization that works across the globe, really in the intersection of nature, climate, and people. And our focus really is how will countries transition at a speed and scale that is good for people, good for nature and climate. So that's why this book is about that and how does the transition work. But the most important thing you need to know about is that where Jinhua is sitting right now at MIT. I actually was a student there for many years, and I'm so excited that I'm able to do this together with Jinhua. Thank you for having me, Jinhua.
This is wonderful, Annie. Let me reinforce the norm of this forum. That is, everybody contribute one idea. Here, I'm referring to the audience here, right? Please either have a comment or a question to Annie and type it in directly into the chat. To warm the audience up, I prepared two quizzes. The first one to understand people's real feeling on this, right? How do you personally feel about the current global climate action policy? Hopeful, mixed, deeply concerned, or totally given up? Yes. So far, 90 people participated. I'll give a few more seconds. See. Okay, 112. Let me end the poll and share the result. So Annie, can you see the result? Okay, good. Yeah, 65% deeply concerned. That's right.
3% hopeful.
3% hopeful. Yeah. Yeah. Hopefully, after we listen to you and read the book, have more. So that's the first one. Yeah. Thank you. So the second one is in terms of particular action. What do you see as the most visible and impactful pathway forward? Yes. We only put a single choice here. We know this is not scientific here, right? Just we want to get a rough sense, right? Yeah, country collaboration, technology innovation, business alignment, local action, and individual behavior change. So 110 people participated so far. Just a few more seconds. Okay, I'll end the poll now and share the result. Yeah, it's quite more evenly distributed than I thought. Okay.
This is very good, actually.
Yeah, interesting. Technology innovation 27. Nice. Okay, good. Yeah, thanks everyone. So, and let's get started on this, right? The first thing I mentioned that half of your career is in World Bank, focused on economic development, right? Then the second half at World Resource Institute focuses on climate change. For that, I want you both share with us your personal experience, what does this translation mean, how they connected, but also let me give you a common layperson view here, right? Which is the two are often at odds with each other, economic development and climate change. If I don't have a lunch on the table tomorrow, who cares about 30 years ago, later, what happened to the planet? So I want to see why you reject the notion and argue the two are actually deeply connected and dependent of each other.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And if you just look at my own work, I was hired directly from when I was at MIT, when I was finishing my PhD, to go join the World Bank as a poverty expert, as an urban poverty expert. This was my job for a long time. And I worked at the World Bank for 20 years. And as you can imagine, if you can simplify it, the objective of the World Bank is to reduce poverty. That's the single objective. There are many things you need to do. And by the time I actually left the World Bank, I was actually more convinced than ever that you cannot solve poverty and climate change separately.
Mm.
And that, I must say, is a big transition, even for the World Bank. Even if you go to the World Bank today, not everyone believes, a lot of people do, but not everyone believes that. And by the time I came to WRI, which was a very well-known climate organization, I came to WRI about 12 years back. And I actually worked with Anjali, who's on the screen here. I ran the cities program. I was convinced that you need to solve these two problems together because they're not two different problems. Simply because the people, if you think that let's solve poverty first, which is what we thought of the World Bank, that if you solve poverty, rich countries don't have these problems, so they will figure it out yourself. That there is not enough time to solve poverty and then come and figure out what to do with climate change, because the climate already is. Last year, we had about $600 billion of loss, just physical loss from climate change. That is twice the amount of money that goes transferred from rich countries to less rich countries as development aid, twice the amount. So if we don't actually think about it together, we will not actually solve either of them. And something I write about in the book, and hopefully we can talk more about it, climate change is a very, the impact of climate change happens everywhere. But the impact of climate change is disproportionately felt by poor people and vulnerable countries across the world. And it's a poster child of unfairness. So if you don't actually attack them together, there is no path forward. And the corollary is also true, Genwa. The future growth of the world, and there's enough evidence of that, is actually in the investment transition of economic growth, of low carbon development, of jobs, quality of life, better air quality, better water. These are all connected to a better quality of life of the human civilization. And so one is a negative framing that you can't do without one another. The other is the positive framing that the only way we will actually prosper as a civilization, about 10 billion people in 2050, is a very different kind of development than we have today. So those are the things. Luckily for me, to be honest with you, by the time I came to the WRI, I think the whole world was changing. The climate people of the world. I don't come from climate, right? I come from development. The climate people in the world also was changing, and I was very lucky that that's what happened when I arrived at WRI.
I see. Thank you so much for actually changing the mindset on this, right? On this, maybe tell us a little bit more about the professionals. You said in World Bank, the primary thing is to solve the poverty problem. How much World Bank colleagues have caught up on the notion, this is also a climate problem? Similarly, from WRI, most focus on climate, how much you have to convince your colleague that this is also economic development problem? Or are they all pretty much on par with each other and get to the joint thinking on this?
I think there's a lot of emerging consensus across, but it is not true that everyone is on board. Even my close colleagues in the World Bank, though World Bank has a climate strategy and everything, there are quite a few people who still believe, poverty in the poorest country in the world is much bigger problem, that we should focus on it. And I just want to point out that is a very important problem.
Right.
But that's not the problem. The problem is the framing of either or. You can do this or that.
Yeah.
The question is, how do we actually do better in maternal health or child education or schools that get flooded or hospital clinics in the middle of rural areas in India that don't have energy, can get renewable energy because it's the solution is disaggregated. That's the kind of stuff we need to talk about rather than waste our time arguing which is more important.
I see.
I think that is true also at WRI. I think WRI and my colleagues here, some of them are from WRI. I think when I arrived, there were a lot more climate-centric people here than today. I think we are actually becoming much better. But my view, as you can see throughout the book, is that we will not win this battle just thinking about carbon. We will only win this battle if the policies are good for people. And that is a perspective I think we need to get better at, and I think we are increasingly getting better at.
Good. Thank you. Yeah. So you had decades of frontline experiences, right? So when you say you are hopeful, it's pragmatic yet hopeful vision on that, right? There's one sentence you wrote that struck me. You said you define a narrow path to a hopeful future and offer a radical new practice here. When you say narrow path, what do you mean? Elaborate that.
The narrow path is simply that there are the whole argument of the book is that we are actually in a climate-wise, we are not making progress in anywhere the speed and scale we need. And path exists for us to get to a place. And you can see that the countries, there are 60 examples in the book, one after another. One great example is actually, that's not in the book, what happened in Pakistan in the last few years. Pakistan now has 25% of energy supply from renewable sources, which has happened in the last few years, which is an incredible transformation. It didn't happen because of some grand government policy. It happened because the most convenient thing in Pakistan today is to go to the market and buy a solar panel, put it in a roof, and get the expertise to do that. That is what the market is doing. And because it's the most convenient and dependable thing for you to do for businesses, for farmers, for households, that transformation is taking place right now in the worlds across. And that is, we need to figure out how to access. So the path, what I'm talking about, exists, but it will not happen on its own.
Right.
That we have to make choices as countries, as businesses, as individual, as in multilateral. And those choices is what makes it narrow, because the world, we don't have enough time to just think about, oh, this will happen. It will happen. I completely believe the technological transition will happen because the technologies are better. Everyone will be driving an electric vehicle at some point. The question is, how fast will that happen? And will it happen in time? And that is what the narrow path is. And that is what the world is arguing, that we need to focus into opportunities we have for exponential change and transition. And I argue in the book that where the technology actually is being delivered by the market at a speed faster than even our optimists like us in WRI. Look at just this forum is mobility. So I hope there are a lot of transport professionals here. If you just look at the fact that how fast electric mobility is happening, 25% of sales of vehicles last year, 25% was electric. It's faster than anyone predicted even 3 years back. Right? So that is what we need to figure out. How do you exponentially change the speed and scale? And my argument is that it just because the technology is there, it will not happen on its own. What we need to focus on is how do we orchestrate the change we need on the ground? How do we bring the pieces together? And the 60 examples I show in the book, which are positive examples, every example is this idea of bringing different institutions, different organizations together to work together. That is where we're failing, I think, not in the other side.
See, that's great. I think I will come back to the point of orchestration, right? That's a theme threading the whole book here, right? We'll come back to that. Let me maybe ask two more narrowly defined questions. One important part in this is the business industry, right? In the book, you mentioned in 1998, 3 companies, British Petroleum, BP, Monsanto, General Motors, GM, all 3 of them made a bold proclamation on behalf of the planet. They say, we are successful global business. We are ready to do our part to protect the Earth's climate. Right? That they said like 20, almost 30 years ago. Right? Today, how do you think of the industry is doing? Particularly make the point that this voluntary standard is not effective on this, right? So a standard useless if nobody uses it and nobody enforces it, right? So what's your assessment of the current state of the industry, and what do you call for the business leader to do?
Yeah, so there's a chapter for people
Yeah,
in the call who haven't read the book on business,
yeah.
and the chapter is called Limits of Voluntary Action. And it's, I think, the most least popular chapter inside WRI, because WRI is very well known for the last 20 years for actually helping set up voluntary standards for GAG protocol, which was created by WRI and our partners, which actually helps about 97% of Fortune 500 companies to measure their carbon, or SBTI. But and the chapter talks about the history of business action on, and starting with what you just said, Monsanto and GM and others, is that businesses, my view is that if you look at what has happened over the years and what's happening right now in the United States, that businesses will do some part, and they're doing a lot of part, voluntarily, especially businesses that are consumer facing, because voluntary action allows them to have an important reputational gain, a social license to operate, right? In as a business, which is important, good, and a lot of good things have happened. But there are limits to what businesses will do voluntarily, because some businesses actually have to change their business model to be able to be. So if you're a cement producer, right, you need high heat at 800 degrees. It's very hard for you to actually decarbonize without figuring out what to do about the high heat part, how to have a electric furnace, and what will it cost, and how do you make it profitable? Or if you produce steel, for example, if you are even if you're a consultant, say you are BCG, a consulting firm, you actually don't have a lot of carbon footprint except flying. You fly all the time, everywhere. And if the flying doesn't get zero carbon, you actually cannot be zero carbon organization. So what I'm saying is limits without business model change, right? What I'm arguing is that we have come to a point where more voluntary action is not going to get us to where we need to go. We only see marginal shift, and businesses keep shifting their position on this topic as the political climate shifts. And we see this everywhere, right? And that is not a shock, because businesses want to succeed. That's why they exist, to make sure they're creating a profit. So my argument in the book is that if you really want to, business is a very important part of the economy. 60-70% of the economy is business, it's not government. So if businesses don't change, you don't get to 1.5 or anywhere near 1.5 degree. Climate can't be fixed without businesses. So the question is, what will allow businesses to change? I argue in the book, two things I think are needed. One is policy change, right? If we had policy shift that forces business to behave a particular way, and to be honest, people like us had believed when we set up SBTI in 2015, which is a organization that certifies net zero transition for businesses. By 2020, we thought we won't be needed, because there'll be policies that will force companies to do it. That hasn't happened. So the policies are limited. Europe, you see more happening. In some other countries, there are more happening. The other way to decarbonize, and this is where I think MITs of the world are very important, is if you can figure out how to make decarbonization profitable.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So if you look at, and that is where those are the two vehicles that are I think can produce durable outcome for businesses.
Yeah.
And we need to do both. Both are connected to each other, and not just focus on voluntary action.
Right. Oh, thank you for clarifying that. When I read that chapter, I said, I was quite impressed, because you guys developed those standards, right? SBTI, such a contribution, and you offer such a frank criticism of your own effort on that, right? So I really applaud that spirit.
Yeah, I hope you don't see it as a criticism, but you see it as limits.
Yeah, the limit
of that. Do to the world. Because indeed. I hope no one from WRI is listening to you right now.
Right. On that, but you mentioned this MIT's role, right? On that, I just share, even MIT, there are quite a bit of difficult conversations. For example, MIT Energy Initiative work with ExxonMobil, works with BP, work with many of the oil companies to help them prepare the transition to the sustainability with the specific technology contributions, right? But within the campus, we have a lot of criticism to that. right? Saying MIT, you shouldn't engage with this industry at all. You're selling the soul to the industry, for example, right? It's not an easy conversation in this part. But I think what you mentioned on how do you make decarbonization profitable? That's such amazing, important idea. And for higher education, I think that's the job to really make this technically feasible, and then with the policy support needs to happen.
And find the technology and the business model.
Yeah.
In the book, Jinhua, it's not a transport story,
Yeah.
and we should talk more because, as you can imagine, my city's background, I'm very excited about that. There is people listening to us might think, oh, this is just a paper dream. It's not, it's just a theoretical idea that it's profitable. There's a story in the book about the world's biggest furniture company, which is IKEA. So IKEA, which you know what that is, right? I hope you have a Billy bookcase.
Yeah, we actually have.
IKEA in 2016 had a net zero, put together their net zero plan. And since then to now, which is 11 years, they actually have decarbonized regularly. So they're 26 or 28% less carbon footprint, while they have grown their business 25% in this time.
Yeah.
So there's a bifurcation of their profit and their decarbon. So it is possible, right? The most interesting thing that I guess you told me and I document in the book is that while decarbonizing, they found out to decarbonize, they need to be much more resource efficient, meaning use less material.
Yeah.
And that is what made them profitable.
Right. Yeah.
So you see what I mean? The business model change, it is possible. And that is what is so exciting about this. And that is where you need to be working with Sloan School to figure out how technology, practice, and business can work together.
Yeah, that's interesting. So the client motivation actually supported double bottom line here, right? That's just, So let move to another topic on the multilateralism, right? That's probably the very fractured today, and arguably more so than any point in recent decade on this, with geopolitics in turmoil. How do you believe country can still cooperate meaningfully on this, right? Both in kind of general principles, what do you think the country should think? But also there's one specific point you mentioned that you said it's time to change the decision-making structure of COP, right? That's also, I want to speak both at the general principle level, but also the specific suggestion. Yes.
Yeah, let me talk about the general first, and then I will talk about COP, because there's a whole chapter about the COP process. I think the general thing is very well captured by, I don't know how many of you saw Mark Carney's speech at Davos, where he talks about how the multilateralism is fragmented and what that he thinks what will happen is multiple multilateralism, include multiple islands of countries collaborating with each other. Basically, what he was saying that the middle powers will actually get together, and then he didn't include China or Canada in middle power, which made them middle power. But I'm sure China doesn't believe it's a middle power. Neither is Canada. But the point he was making, the American hegemony is going to go away, and there'll be other clusters of people working together, which is true. I believe that. I thought it was. If you're coming from, I come from India. Indians or China, they already believed that there are multiple ways to do global cooperation. China, for example, 124 countries in the world, China is the first trading partner. So they have figured out what that looks like. So that is, I think, true. There will be a lot of already happening in a year of tariff, that US tariff we actually seen all the multiple countries actually negotiating with each other. And that's actually positive and good. The problem with that model is that the smaller island and the countries that are not big economies left out of it. The most vulnerable countries that actually have the biggest problem with climate change are not part of these deals. No one is negotiating with small islands. They negotiate with India, they're going to do China, they're going to do Brazil. So this model is good in a way that should be multiple relationship. I think I'll give you an example in a minute how these relationships can produce great outcomes. But this model does mean the smaller and weaker countries or vulnerable countries will, and that is why you do need a global forum. Because the best part of COP in the chapter that I wrote is that it is flawed. It's a flawed process, and it is frustrating, and people are frustrated about it. But the best part of it is that every country in the world has a voice. And one of the striking part that I've documented is that the biggest change in climate discussion in Paris, which is seen as one of the most successful of these meetings, from 2 degrees, all the countries were agreeing to 2 degrees, but then they actually agreed to 1.5 degree. That change came from Marshall Island, a small country, and they actually mobilized a consensus among the partners. So or discussion loss and damage was animated by Pakistan's. So this voice is very important, and I believe that you cannot actually talk about climate at a level at a useful level that doesn't include all the countries, and it'll going to be difficult. But I also want to point out the difficulty people have had in multilateralism, and there's good reason to be skeptical of it, because the reason these multilateral institutions like UN and others were set up primarily was to keep peace in the world, to stop wars.
Yeah.
And that actually hasn't been very successful, right? As you can see from the newspaper. So the skepticism of multilateralism is warranted. At the same time, I want to point out, every time we have had a climate meeting, even this time with the United States not joining it, countries across the world, actually all countries across the world, show up and contribute because they realize this is an important fora for them to be part of. And your question about changes in, I think that 3 kinds of things the COP process could change to make it more effective. One is there's very little accountability in the COP process. You can sign something, if you don't do it, nothing happens. Right. That can't really work in the long term. Yeah. And the second is, I love the idea of everyone having a voice, but that also allows countries that want to slow down things to actually slow it down. So the decision-making process could be, so I've written in the book that, people should have a voice, but not a veto.
Yeah.
Right. And I also, the third point I make there is that I think there needs to be a lot more discussion on finance in the COP process. So right now, COP process are populated by Minister of Environments. I think we need more Minister of Finance there. So but I just want to underline, even if people said, "Oh, we don't like COP, we should get rid of it," I guarantee you, the world will then invent a forum which looks exactly like the COP, because we need a forum for every country to come together.
I see. Yeah, thank you for sharing that experience on this. And also the specific suggestion of what COP structure could be enhanced on that. I find this maybe a side point. The same spirit can be applied to discussion of AI. That's another major issue. Multilateralism is really necessary on this. We don't even have a COP. However criticism we have COP, we don't even have a COP for AI so far. Yes.
We don't. But before we do that, I really hope the AI, the bigger companies that are producing AI or working, I hope they can work together more.
Yeah, right. Yeah, multilateralism even at the corporation level.
Yeah,
yes, right.
Yeah, yes. That would be a huge positive thing, I think, at this point.
Indeed. Yeah. And in the book, you actually mentioned several things about AI and the potential using AI for the discovery, for science, for the engineering innovation. There's actually a lot of positive things that could happen on this, right? Okay, maybe get to the broader theme about this orchestrating change, right? I think you argue that's the broad point across the book. At any level, this is the fundamental thing. We have the technology. We could set up policies, but we fail to collaborate on orchestrating the changes, right? For that, I'd like you to maybe give some examples, right? And also to say, can the idea operate at a different scale, right? Could be a small village, small town, a big organization, or at the country level. How do you orchestrate at multiple layers of this global governance? Yes.
Yeah. So the central argument, as you're saying, Junua, that I feel why we're not making progress, as I mentioned already, if you just look at technology, like look at energy technologies of batteries or solar or wind or electric vehicles, each of them actually have the market is producing solutions that are ahead of any predicted curve. I know we thought in 2018 or 19 when solar and wind became price competitive with fossil fuel, everyone said, oh, it's the batteries. Batteries will hold us back because they're so expensive. We won't have batteries. Actually, battery price, as you know very well, has come down 10 times over 3 years. And CATL, one of the two biggest battery manufacturer in China, they predict it'll be 10 times cheaper within a year. So that is the speed at which technology shifts, right? And people said 10 years back, as soon as it's all about economics, it's all about price. So if solar and wind becomes price competitive with the fossil fuel, then we have solved the problem. Actually, solar and wind has been price competitive and better than fossil fuel for 6 to 7 years now. Does it mean the whole world is actually changing to renewable energy? No, renewable energy is only 12% of the world's energy supply right now. So the question is, why is that not happening? Because what I mean is because we had not been able to get the pieces that we need together. Sometimes it's policy, sometimes finance, sometimes it's labor to actually build things. Sometimes it's land, sometimes it's behavior. Like we have electric buses in the world. Does it mean we can stop people from using their cars? No, we have to work. That is the systems approach of what we need to do. And that is what we are failing, this ability and the skill to work across organization. And I have argued in the book that we actually have that knowledge in the world. We've just chosen not to focus. We are too enamored by silver bullet solution like electric vehicle rather than people not using their cars and actually using public transport, for example. That is a much more complex problem, right? And so that is what that orchestration I feel is very failing. But I've argued that it is not because we don't have that knowledge. It is we have chosen not to use it because we think, some silver bullet exists somewhere. And I'll give you one of my favorite example of this multi-level coordination that is needed and success is this example that's in the book. There's a cities chapter in the book. You won't be surprised given my background. It's about London. The story is from London. And it's a very interesting story of politics, technology, and actually orchestration. So in London in 2003 or 2004, I think, they had the first mayor of London. His name was Ken Livingstone. And he was a left-leaning mayor. The people called him Red Ken. And one of the first things he did, he said, they create Transport for London, which is the TfL, which is integrated all the services. And then he said, there's too much congestion in London. We're going to have a congestion charge for vehicles that's coming to the middle of London city, about a very small area at that time. And remember, congestion charge is a politically very difficult idea. New York took 20 years to figure out to implement it. It's not a very difficult idea in a lot of places everywhere in the world, but it's very, very difficult idea in Western part of the world because other parts of the world have this. Anyway, in London, everyone said this is a terrible idea. He's going to fail. And London, the bettors in London said 4-1, he'll be out of office within a year. What happened is since then, 2005 to now, 2026, last 20 years, not only did that policy survive, the subsequent mayors, and there have been mayors from different parties. Boris Johnson was one of the mayors. He's not a supremely left-leaning mayor, right? Every mayor actually expanded the policy of congestion charging across London. Now, Sadiq Khan, the mayor, has expanded even further to cover most of London. And Sadiq Khan doesn't even talk about congestion. He talks about air quality and mothers and children to get political support. So why is it that a policy that seems so politically non-palatable actually not only stayed for 20 years, but actually expanded, didn't matter who was in charge of the City of London? And the answer to that question is that policy actually made people's lives better. That the money they collected, they actually made better buses. They created bike lanes. They actually even had enough money to add a new line to their metro system, their underground, London Underground. So the people's experience of the city and the air quality improved. That is a better. So when you actually make it better for people, it becomes a new social construct of what is acceptable for City of London. And it doesn't matter who is in charge. That is what you do. And that's why I think this, you can see how these pieces are connected, right? People's air quality, health, mothers, children, technology, finance, and the political viability of a policy. This is what we need to put together, Jim. And this knowledge exists. That how do you do these things together so that it's good for people, so it's politically durable? You can see in the United States and Western Europe right now how much backwards we are going in climate policy deliberately with misinformed information and data. But that's what I think is our hope for the narrow path forward.
Wonderful. Yeah. Thank you for mentioning that story. Between 2006 and 2007, I was a PhD student at MIT. I took 2 years off, worked at the Transport London.
You did?
Yeah. In the modeling,
tell me about that story.
And in the team of modeling the effect of congestion pricing there, right? So I love the stories you mentioned on that, and how Red can really push a very unpopular policy successfully, and actually the local residents respect this. Yeah, and long lasting. Of course, it's triggered by congestion, but it exactly have the impact on pollution, on climate, etc. It's much more multi-objective success in that way.
Yes. And it makes a better city. London today is a better city, right? That transformation. It's not just about transport. It just has more public spaces, bike spaces. Amsterdam went through a very similar transition and transformation. Everyone thinks that Amsterdam is a biking city today. It wasn't like that 35 years back, these transformations are absolutely possible.
Yeah, on that also, the last point you mentioned that people always talk about U.S. city. We always say, U.S. city are so different from others. We are not going to do all those things, But as you said, Amsterdam 30 years ago was not like that either, right? But with the generation, can change that. Yeah, I see Anjali is there. You contribute so much to the city program as well. Feel free to jump in if you have ideas.
Anjali can, as she becomes your member of your fellowship, I think this is the kind of stuff I think she can bring to the table, because that's the kind of thing that the cities program works on.
Right. Yeah. Maybe Anjali, do you want to say a few words? Yeah, please. So let me add you in.
Just saying, happy to do that, Jinwa, as the year goes on. But no, I think we should keep the focus here on some of these great stories from the book that Ani is sharing. Just great examples. My own PhD, by the way, was in congestion pricing in London. And how I was concerned we're talking about 20 years ago. So we're talking about when the policy was very new and all of us transportation geeks were watching it and watching as it unfolds, and TfL put out its annual, evaluations of how things are going. And what used to concern me significantly at the time was the statement that all their reports had, which said, the economic impacts of congestion pricing in the City of London are broadly neutral, quote unquote. And so began the saga of my PhD at broadly neutral. How do you disaggregate that? Who is more impacted and who's less, and which groups and which businesses? And it speaks to what Ani is saying about these policies. They have this array of impacts. There's the emissions impact, there's the health impact, there's the congestion reduction, quality of life, there's the economic impact. And I just think that, coming also from transportation and broadening my perspective a bit, we need much more sophisticated metrics and ways to capture all of these impacts and benefits and costs and bring them into investment decisions, policy decisions, more sophisticated and nuanced policy design, and so on. So, very happy to be hearing these stories, and I'll shut up now. You should get on with your conversation.
Thank you so much, Anjali, for joining us. Annie, a moment you said that the COP mostly attendee Minister of Environment, but you want Minister of Finance also be there, right? So to that point, I think toward the conclusion of the book, you said if every finance minister or central banker can adopt one new metric or disclosure, can you recommend what would be the single change that would most accelerate the transition?
And just to be So in COP, there are like 40, 50,000 people at COP. COP is this gathering of climate-centric people.
Yeah.
I meant the people who negotiate on behalf of countries are the environment ministers. And in the future, COPs will be actually about money. It's not about, because initially the COPs were about ambition. Like how ambitious do we need to be? And to one point, what we have found out, and the book, I make this point that ambition is great. We should have ambition. But today, the ambition, if you just add up all the ambition of all the countries, all businesses, all the cities, we would be at 1.7, 1.8 degree higher than pre-industrial level. But today, actually, we are 2.8 degrees higher, what's happening in the world. So the gap between what the world promised to do and what is actually doing is 1 degree. And it might seem a little, 1 degree is 75% of where we need to go. So if we just implemented what we have promised, forget more ambition, we would be 75% closer to our goal. That's an enormous implementation gap. And finance is not the only problem. Finance is one of the problems, and orchestration is the other problem of that gap. So that's why I talk about why finance is such an important part. My view is the finance ministries, to illustrate my point, I want to share a funny story with you. I was invited, there's a forum called Coalition of Finance Ministers. The World Bank hosts a forum, which has, I think, 70 or 80 or 100 members now. So I was invited a few years back to talk to them about adaptation to this forum of finance minister. And remember, this is not just developing or poor countries, it's finance minister of all countries. And I said, we are facing the real cost now from climate-related disaster. I said $600-700 billion every year. Some people estimate it's $1 trillion a year. So there are macroeconomic problems because of climate change, not just problem that you and I will face. That if a bridge flow goes, or the port doesn't work, or schools get flooded, there's macro problems in your economy. So how many of you actually have someone in your team who can model the macroeconomic shock in your modeling of growth? And I can tell you, I was shocked. Not one person raised their hand. These are ministers of finance. So this is what I'm saying. The capacity of ministries, and this is that we need new capacities, both to do two things. One, to model and understand what the macro shocks to the economy is. But the more important thing is, how do we shape the economy for this transition so the economy can benefit from this transition? Right. I think that very few countries, except China kind of figured this out 10 years back, right? If you look at China, invested $800 billion last year, $800 billion on renewable energy, just one country. That's where their thinking is, But other countries are not. So those are the two shifts. I would think, how do you actually think about how do you grow in this economy successfully, and how do you protect yourself from the climate impacts?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, indeed, China has really explored and almost fine-tuned the pathway where economic development and climate is really consistent in that as this, right? Yeah. So last question from me, so then we leave some time for the audience questions, is tell a little about MIT and you here, right? It's you studied here, you tell so much about MIT's impact on you, and also what do you see MIT should do even more in contribute to the climate solution there? Along with it, in the audience, there are many students and a younger generation. How do we prepare this group themselves to embrace this climate action?
Yeah. Look, as you heard me a few weeks back, I love my time at MIT. And I feel lucky to be able to say that every day I use what I learned in my work, which is I meet so many people who tell me, oh, I have nothing, what I do today has nothing to do with what I studied, which is not the case for me, at least. I feel this is a very good question. I just want to say from my narrow perspective, how I see and the young people we hire, we are a relatively large organization. We have a lot of young people. In my mind, I think there are 2-3 things that will be supremely helpful. One is, first of all, students ask me, what should I be working on? And my answer to that, you can work on anything, because every part of the economy needs to change. You could make a difference in any of the companies or nonprofit or schools. That's not the question. The question is, what are you going to do? Not what sectors will you work in. And I think organizations like institutions like MIT, two things. One is MIT is very good of instilling and training people in deep technical knowledge, which is very, very important to solve, innovate. We need a lot of innovation, especially in food systems. We need tons of innovation in protein and. But the two other things that I want to layer on is one is systems thinking, how the system actually needs to change, and what system we are part of. Like in WRI, we have chosen to work on three systems. Cities is one of them, energy system is, and the food system. Three. We only work on these three systems because we think these three systems has the highest chance of helping people, climate, and nature at the same time. Like, how do you do these three things at the same time? So that's one skill set. The other skill set, which I think I got a lot out of my training at DUS, was actually understanding and appreciate how institutions work with each other. And this orchestration is about how institutions actually learn how to work faster and better together, not against each other. Because the institution, by definition, create barriers, right? Create walls around it. And where failure appears are these walls. And how do you actually create a whole generation of leaders that are able to break these walls systematically to bring the system change we need and the speed and scale we need? I want to repeat, deep technical knowledge is foundation of it. It's not an either-or question, right? It's not that you need to be just a generalist. No one wants like we want people who can translate, and I hope you train them because I would love to hire those people.
Thank you. That's great advice. So there are actually many students in the audience there to listen to this. So let me give the time to John for the Q&A from audience. John, please.
Thank you, Jinma.
Ani, thanks so much. So many questions. I want to start with what you just pointed out, which is this concept of systems level change. So we had a comment very early on from Eric Sabina, where he said, with apologies for the non-gender neutral language, there's a quote that goes, "It's difficult to get a man to understand something when his salary depends on him not understanding it." And he's asking if you could reflect on that. Similarly, Jack Niles made the point that, a fundamental problem for affecting change is the reward system. Governments are swayed or ruled by the influence of money from special interests. Now, you mentioned behavioral change. I think the question here is, what do you see as the levers for change? Can you provide another example, maybe beyond the London example, where you really can affect that systems change, somehow get into people's heads and into their hearts and change the outcome, change the system for the better?
These are such good questions, John. Let me respond by my own experience in one very specific experience that kind of transcends these three questions that you just shared, John. And I want to thank the three people who asked this question. In the beginning of the book, there's an introductory chapter about my experience in Aceh, which is a province in Indonesia. It's the northern tip of Indonesia. And I was working at the World Bank in Indonesia at that time. And the day after Christmas, 2004, there was a massive tsunami. I don't know, there might be too many young people here that hit India, hit Thailand, but actually massively hit Indonesia. And the city of Banda Aceh was actually flattened, literally. 250,000 people died. There's a massive, massive thing that happened. So anyway, I was head of the infrastructure of the World Bank, so I was sent by the bank to figure out how to help the Indonesian government work together. And my experience there, and I document that in the book, but it was transformational for me as a person, is that we all, crisis brings people together, and we all came out, and we had bank, I had rented a house there, and I observed their work. I worked there for 2 years, actually helping the government agency with the infrastructure, transport, water, all these things. And because I was the World Bank, so I was kind of coordinating the donor communities on this particular topic. But what I noticed there is that many agencies were involved, from the government, for international, many NGOs. We would gather every morning in this house we rented at 7 a.m. in the morning to share information, strategize, figure out, help the government. But what I observed there was none of these people, the 50 odd people that gather every morning, actually reported to anyone. None of us had any structural relationship with each other. But we all worked together to actually, because we believed that we needed to do that. And that gave me this inspiration that it is possible for us to work across agencies with trust and actually get a much bigger outcome than if you go to Aceh today, John, you will not even see even a little smidgen of the disaster it had 20 years back. It's a thriving city. It's where reconstruction has been done well, and not just because of us, because of the government, because of the people. But what I'm saying is, and I conclude from that experience, is that for us to solve the problems we talked, and I were talking about this orchestration of change, we absolutely need leaders that can lead and can bring people together and go across. But we also need leaders who are able to follow and be part of the orchestration. Because if all of us want to lead all the time, we will never orchestrate. We will create silos. And that is my lesson of leadership that is kind of central to the questions you're asking. What do we, and that's how I feel about it. That's how I feel that we actually need a different kind of leadership for this world of orchestrated change.
Absolutely. Just a specific question about transportation and mobility. I think when you were speaking about electric vehicles, Kara Cederman added this comment saying, the more fundamental problem is continued reliance on any kind of motor vehicle, i.e., I love this term, motonormativity. The proliferation of electric vehicles is basically a smart move for the automotive industry to continue the reliance on cars and have people feel better about driving. I want to ask you to reflect on that in the climate context. I mean, my observation is that there's kind of when you ask people, how do you solve climate change for transportation? There's sort of two camps. One camp says we got to fix the car. We got to electrify the car, move to cleaner fuels, etc. A second camp says the car itself is the problem. And that's what we need to move people to public transportation, to micromobility, reform zoning, and so forth. How do you feel about balancing those two camps? Do you see them as either or? Do you see them as and? How do you think about that?
So I'm slightly familiar with this topic because I work in cities for a long time, and my answer, this is a very good question with the thing. This is where we need systems thinking more than anything else, not a single solution. We need cars in rural areas where there's no public transport. So and they should all be electric. But whether car mixes in cities or not, that's a different question. And cities actually can be much better off with different kind of modes of transportation that is shared or public or walking or biking. That is the mix we need. Give you an example. There's a story in the book about Delhi. Delhi bought 600 electric buses. So I use that example to talk about how does it become, that's a technological purchase, right? You buy 600 electric buses. How do you convert that a good outcome? What is a good outcome here? Is people get to places we need to go, and we actually reduce carbon. That's the two good outcomes in this. That's the assumption and in Delhi's case, for it to be low carbon, a few things have to happen. One is the energy source needs to be zero carbon, which is not the case yet. It needs to be available in the bus depots, which is not the case yet. They need to get rid of the diesel buses they just bought. And the most importantly, people who are buying cars have to stop using cars and think this is a good way to move around, which is not the case in Delhi yet. So what I'm saying is, for the system to have a good outcome, this is what orchestration is needed. All these pieces need to work together. And cities that are doing electric buses and things are great if it's it ultimately needs to get us to the way we need to do. So to answer your question, this is where I think we need systems thinking and systems to work with the outcome. My view and WRI's view on this is the outcome we want is access for people to get to where we need to go in the most convenient, cheapest, low carbon way they can. And those access solutions will be different. I don't think electrifying cars is actually, just to be clear, John, electrifying car and the business momentum there is right now is a good thing, because there's a momentum finally in the transport sector that is good for climate. But that is not going to solve everything. I mean, we're going to have a transportation conference next Tuesday, I think. And I'm supposed to open it. This is exactly what I'm going to say. This is great. 25% mobility electric vehicle sale last year. How do we use it to actually create transport solutions for everyone? And everyone's transport solution is not going to be electric cars. Far from it. I mean, people in India don't even own cars. I mean, very few people own cars in aggregate.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, indeed. No, so many more great questions on it about public policy, AI. We will share this chat file with you. Let me turn it back to Genoa.
Sure.
Thank you, John.
And this has been such a fantastic conversation. Thank you so much on this. For the audience, I indeed encourage people to actually read the book seriously on this, right? So here's the book. I'm halfway through. I'll be honest, I haven't finished the whole book yet on this, but it's really worth reading on this. So the last question for you, Annie, when people turn the final page of the new global possible, sit there with these ideas, ponder about it, what's the single most important insight or fitting or call to action you hope this idea to stay with them long after the book is read?
Wow. I think the idea I want people to stay with it, that what we are in the middle of right now is a vast economic transition, economy that's based on fossil fuels, economy that will not be based on fossil fuel in the future. And the fossil fuel is actually embedded in everything we do, not just transport, not just energy, our shampoo bottle, everything is fossil fuel. So how do we get to that? And that is a pretty big transition. Economy that's 200 years old to transition in 25 years, that's a big task. And I want people to get that perspective, because I hear too many people are disappointed how fast we're moving. We should be disappointed, but we should not be surprised where we are, right? So that's the first thing. The second thing I want people to think, that look at the whole world today, because I live in Washington, D.C. It's going to be easy to be depressed if you live in D.C. If you look at the whole world, the world is actually moving forward with many solutions. Look at what's happening. And there is a path forward for all of us here in this call, all us professionals. Our job is to find that path that is politically viable, because the solutions exist right now, not in the future. Right now they exist. And just for us, our job is to bring the solutions and make them politically viable, not just on a textbook, not in a classroom, that they are actually used and they're durable. And I want to say to everyone, if you look around deeply across the world, things are actually happening. And it's a question is, can you and I, all of us, speed it up?
This is wonderful. It's such a brilliant discussion today. Thank you so much, Annie. Everybody, please join me. Thank Annie for today's presentation.
Thank you very much, Inma. Thank you for having me.